Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to start with something that can happen after the careful work is already done. You've built the piece, you've made the decisions, nothing is obviously wrong. You can measure, refine, paint, adjust, and keep working until the miniature seems finished. If someone asked you to explain each decision, you probably could. The wall is the right height, the figure is in scale, the colors work. And yet, the piece still does not quite convince you. The parts may be correct, but they are not fully supporting one another. Your eye keeps returning to some place that should not matter as much as it does. The figure looks present for a second, then turns back into a painted object. Maybe the room reads as a room, but only briefly. That is the gap I want to talk about today. We often describe miniatures as small versions of real things, but that description misses the more interesting problem. A miniature is not only reduced, it's organized. It's a set of cues asking the viewer to accept one version of the world and ignore another. This is what I mean by controlled illusion. Not a gimmick, not a trick, a way of arranging what the viewer can see, infer, and complete. A miniature decides what becomes clear, what stays quiet, what is allowed to dominate, and what the viewer has to finish in their mind. A shadow may ask us to believe in depth. A figure's feet may ask us to believe in weight. A worn edge can ask us to believe in repeated use. Each one of these cues is asking for trust. For the illusion to hold, those cues have to agree well enough. Scale, light, surface, and placement do not have to explain everything, but they are more effective if they support the same world. Predictive processing research is useful here because it suggests that perception is not passive. The viewer is constantly testing what the piece seems to promise against what the scene actually supports. That gives us a more useful question than whether every part works on its own. What is this piece asking the viewer to believe, and where do the cues stop supporting that belief? That is where the real work begins. One reason a miniature can feel so powerful is that it gives the viewer a position we almost never have in ordinary life. A full-scale environment never gives itself to us completely. We have to move through it. We have to remember what's behind us, guess what's around the corner, and accept that some of the space will always be outside our immediate view. A miniature changes that relationship. It lets the viewer stand outside the world and look over its arrangement all at once. That can create a feeling of control, although I want to be careful with that word. The viewer does not actually control the miniature world. They cannot enter it, alter it, or change what has happened there. What they have is a special kind of access. The scene can be held in view in a way full-scale space usually cannot. That is part of the illusion. The world becomes finite enough to inspect, but not open enough to enter. You can understand the room without crossing it. You can read the street without walking down it. But the best miniatures often do not leave the viewer in simple overview. They complicate that position. The viewer can see more than they could at full scale, but they can do less. They can inspect the space, but they cannot test it with the body. That tension is part of the controlled illusion. Once the viewer has that outside view, the miniature has another job. It has to decide what becomes clear first. We don't need every detail to recognize a scene. Research on scene perception, especially work by Oliva and Torralba, shows that people can grasp the gist of a scene very quickly before they've inspected all the objects in it. Their work argues that the brain often recognizes the broad condition of a scene before it identifies every individual part. That's important for miniature work because the viewer usually does not begin with the tiny doorknob or the chipped corner of plaster. They begin with the larger arrangement. Is this an interior? Is it a street? A battlefield? Is the space open or compressed? Quiet or active? Is it occupied or abandoned? Before the viewer studies the parts, the miniature has already started setting the terms. The first read sets the expectations for everything else. Once the larger condition is clear, the details have somewhere to belong. If the first read is muddy, the details have nowhere to land. The viewer sees objects, but the scene never fully becomes a place. The eye moves from part to part, but nothing comes together. This is where controlled illusion becomes practical. The maker is not only deciding what to include, the maker is deciding the order in which the viewer takes things in. Where does the eye enter? Where does it stop? What is clear immediately and what is held back until the viewer slows down? Those decisions create the sequence of the piece. Detail is still one of the great pleasures of miniature work, but it should enter at the right moment. Some cues need to register first, some can reward longer looking, some need to stay quiet enough that the main relationship can hold. If every area is equally active, the eye has no path. If the smallest details are clearer than the main spatial idea, the viewer may get trapped in the wrong place. If secondary objects compete too strongly with the central relationship, the piece can become impressive without becoming convincing. That is not a failure of effort, it's a failure of sequence. A miniature usually gives us a fragment of a world rather than the whole thing. It shows a room, a corner, a street, a figure, or a small portion of something larger. The rest has to be implied, but implication only works when the visible part gives the viewer something specific enough to follow. The viewer sees a bit of a table edge, and the mind supplies the rest of the table. The viewer sees one small object partly hidden behind another, and the mind assumes the hidden portion continues behind the obstruction. That last process has a name, amodal completion. It refers to the mind perceiving a whole object even when part of it's hidden. Miniature makers use this constantly. The useful point here is not simply that the mind fills things in, it's that the mind fills things in when the visible information gives it a reliable path. If an opening suggests a room beyond it, the light, angle, and scale cues have to support that suggestion. If they don't, the viewer does not complete the space in the way you want them to. They notice the back wall of the box, or maybe they notice the construction instead of the space. Failure is often found in the gap between what the piece suggests and what the rest of the scene can support. That's why Omission is not the same as leaving things blank. Omission works when the piece gives the viewer enough to continue the scene in a specific direction. A fragment of machinery can imply a larger mechanism if its scale, material, and placement support that larger machine. A corner of a room can imply the rest of the building if the light and edges makes the space feel continuous. The issue is not simply how much the piece shows, it's whether the visible cues point in the same direction. If the scene withholds too much, the viewer has nothing stable to complete. If it explains too much, the viewer has no reason to continue testing the space. The strongest miniature usually works somewhere in the middle. It gives the viewer enough evidence to make a specific continuation feel possible. The important thing is that the cue has to be specific. A door left open is different from a door simply missing. Think of a chair pulled from a table. It's different than a chair placed randomly in the room. The mind extends the scene only when the visible evidence suggests a meaningful continuation. This is not a license to be vague. It's a question of what kind of continuation the piece can actually support. The world can feel larger than the built portion, but only when that larger world grows out of visible evidence rather than wishful thinking. Scale may not be the most obvious fact about a miniature, but it is not a simple thing for the mind. Developmental research on scale errors gives us a strange and useful window into this. Young children sometimes try to interact with miniature objects as if they were full-sized. They may try to sit in a tiny chair, climb into a toy car, or use a small object in a way that fits its identity but not its size. The important point is not that the child can't see the object is small. The more interesting point is that recognition and action can become misaligned. The child recognizes the object, but the body has not fully adjusted to what that recognition means at a different scale. The chair still says sit, the car still says enter, the object still carries an invitation to act, even when the action is impossible. That matters because miniatures are full of implied actions. Doors suggest opening, stairs suggest climbing, streets suggest movement. The miniature activates all of those meanings while physically preventing them. I do not want to overstate the comparison, but the research is useful because it shows that scale is not just measurement. Scale has to be translated between what we see, what we know, and what the body expects to do. That's what makes miniatures so strange. They keep the meaning of use while removing use itself. The object still tells the body what it would allow at full scale, but the body can't answer. So the miniature gives us a world organized around actions the viewer understands but can't perform. It reminds us what these things are for while keeping that use just out of reach. The piece is not only asking the eye to recognize an object, it's asking the body to understand a possibility that can't be completed. A miniature also sits in an unusual category. It's physically an object, but it's organized like an environment. That sounds simple, but it changes how we read it. Most objects ask to be handled or inspected. Most environments ask to be entered or navigated. A miniature does both at once. It sits on a table as a made object, but the viewer reads it as a place with thresholds, distances, interiors, and edges. Spatial cognition research gives us a more precise way to describe this. The mind handles space differently depending on whether we are looking at an object, moving through a place, orienting from our own body, or reading something more like a map. Miniatures sit somewhere between those systems. They're small enough to inspect like objects, but structured enough to understand like places. The viewer can survey the whole scene from outside almost like a map, while also reading it as a space that could be moved through. That double position is not available in the same way at full scale. In a real room, your body limits what you can see. In a map, you have overview, but not the physical suggestion of mountains, cities, streets, or environment. The miniature sits between those two experiences. It gives the viewer the overview of a map and the suggestion of a place without fully becoming either one. This is where controlled illusion becomes more than a useful phrase. The viewer is not reading one cue at a time. The eye is trying to combine color, scale, surface, edges, placement, and proportion into one stable read. Vision research often talks about cue integration, the way the brain combines different signals to judge things like depth, shape, material, and space. In a miniature, those signals do not all carry the same weight. Some dominate, others sit quietly in the background, and when the signals disagree, the viewer may not know why the piece feels wrong, but the conflict is still felt. A miniature can be accurate in one way and still send the wrong signal. A color can match the real object and still look too intense under miniature lighting. Maybe a wall may measure correctly and still look too thin or too crisp or too toy-like because the eye is comparing it to everything around it. That's why miniature work often behaves more like a painting than engineering, even when the construction is precise. The goal is not only to make something correct, it has to be read correctly at scale. A fabric fold may need to be reduced so the figure does not look crumpled. A weathered surface may need stronger value changes than the real object would have because scale compresses the visual information. Anyone who has looked at real rust and then tried to reproduce it at miniature scale has probably run into this. At full size, rust can be powdery, pitted, flaky, crusted, with color and texture working together. Reduce all of that directly and the effect can either disappear or become too coarse for the scale. Push the contrast too far and the surface starts to look theatrical instead of corroded. The miniature has to find a balance between what is physically true and what the eye can actually read. Representational painting gives us a useful comparison here. A painter generally does not paint every leaf on a tree. They create the conditions under which the viewer reads foliage. They control edge, value, temperature, and grouping, and the viewer completes the rest. Miniature work has its own version of that translation. Some things have to be strengthened so they register. Others have to be reduced so they don't dominate the scene. The closer a miniature comes to realism, the less forgiving the cue conflicts become. A simplified figure can be read as convention. A nearly realistic figure asks to be judged by stricter signals: gaze, weight, skin, posture, and expression. Realism is not automatically safer, it simply gives the viewer more opportunities to notice when the cues don't agree. A viewer sees a figure and expects weight. The feet should meet the ground with a certain pressure. The shadow should anchor the body. The pose should show gravity acting on it. If one of those signals contradicts the others, the figure may be beautifully painted and still float in the air. Weathering can also send mixed signals. The color may say rust, but the texture may say powder. The edges may say fresh paint, and the placement may not explain why corrosion happened there. The eye reads the disagreement before it accepts the surface. A viewer sees a seam, a brush mark, or the edge of a box and decides very quickly whether that visible construction belongs to the piece. In a stylized or theatrical miniature, a brush mark may support the visual language. In a piece asking for continuous space, the same mark may pull the viewer out of the scene. The issue is not whether a mark, a seam, color, or texture is allowed to show. The issue is whether it belongs to the kind of illusion the piece is building. A visible mark can support the visual language of the piece, or it can interrupt it. A seam can feel like part of the construction, or it can pull the viewer back to the object. The better question is not only, is this right? It is, what is this cue asking the viewer to trust? And do the other cues back it up? When the other cues support it, the piece holds together. When they don't, that cue may need to be reduced, moved, simplified, or even removed. That is not lowering the standard, that is controlling the illusion. E.H. Gombrich's Art and Illusion is useful here because it reminds us that representation is not simple copying. It depends on perception, convention, and expectation. That's important in miniature work because almost every surface is a translation. Painted shadow stands in for depth. Reduced texture stands in for material. Selective detail stands in for the full complexity of the real thing. A brick wall in miniature is not a brick wall. It's a set of marks, edges, values, textures, and proportions that persuade the viewer to treat it as brick. If the mortar lines are too deep, the wall may become cartoonish. If they're too regular, it may look printed. If every brick is equally described, the surface may become a pattern instead of a wall. The goal is not to make every brick individually impressive. The trick is to make the viewer accept brick wall without stopping to inspect the mechanism. That is the controlled illusion at work. The viewer has to see brick before they start seeing the method used to make it. They may know perfectly well that the wall is painted, carved, printed, or scratched into a surface. But when the surface cues hold together, the eye accepts brick first and analyzes the technique later. That is what makes surface so demanding at small scale. The viewer is not only seeing texture, they're judging whether the texture belongs to the scale, the light, the material, and the world around it. If the technique calls attention to itself too early, the viewer starts reading the method before they accept the place. Gestalt psychology gives us a useful way to think about why some miniature scenes hold together while others feel scattered. The eye does not wait for us to consciously interpret every object. It begins grouping things right away by closeness, similarity, alignment, contrast, and figure-ground relationships. Objects that sit close together may read as related. That always makes me think of Tobler's first law of geography. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. In geography, that idea describes spatial relationships across the landscape. In a miniature, it becomes a useful analogy. Things placed near each other begin to feel connected, whether the maker intended that relationship or not. Repeated shapes can become a pattern. Aligned edges can pull the eye along a path. Strong contrast can separate a figure from the background or make the wrong thing dominate. This may sound like ordinary composition, but miniature scale makes those relationships less forgiving. The space is compressed, so a small shift can change what appears connected, what competes, and what the eye treats as important. A cup placed too close to a figure's hand may imply recent use. Move it slightly and the relationship weakens. A dark vertical shape behind a figure may frame the body, or it may accidentally compete with it. A bright object near the edge of the base may pull attention out of the scene. A line in the floor can guide the eye toward the main action or away from it. A background object can dominate the scene simply because of contrast. A repeated shape can pull attention away from the central relationship. A figure can feel disconnected because its edges, shadows, and orientation do not visually belong to the surrounding space. When a piece fails to hold, it's worth asking not only what's wrong with the parts, but what the parts are doing to each other. Are the important elements grouping in a useful way? Does the background support the figure, or does it fight for the same level of attention? Are the strongest contrasts helping the scene or pulling the eye away from it? In miniature, almost nothing stays visually neutral. The edge of a miniature is never neutral. It tells the viewer where the object stops, but it can also suggest where the world continues. A window or a doorway can suggest that the visible scene is not the whole world, but the same edge can also close the scene down. If it calls too much attention to the material boundary, the viewer becomes aware of the object instead of the implied space. A base can announce itself as a display platform, or it can become a threshold into the scene. A backdrop can either flatten the piece or imply atmosphere. A sidewall can either close the box or make the viewer feel that the room continues outside the visible frame. This is not about fooling the viewer. We know the piece is a miniature. The edge is still visible, but it has to do a job inside the illusion. It can frame the scene, suggest continuation, mark a threshold, or deliberately remind us that we are looking at a made object. What weakens the illusion is an edge that does none of those things clearly. So what does all this mean when you're actually making something? When a piece doesn't hold, I would start here. What is the piece asking the viewer to trust? And where do the cues stop backing it up? Look first for the cue that's carrying too much weight. If the figure needs to feel grounded, the feet, shadow, pose, and surrounding space all need to help create weight. If the scene needs to feel old, the wear should indicate touch or use. If the room needs to feel inhabited, the objects need to suggest some trace of life rather than simply sitting there. The same thing happens with attention. A bright object in the wrong place can pull the viewer away from the main relationship. A strong contrast can fight the structure of the scene. A highly detailed surface can ask for more attention than the piece can afford. Detail near the focal area can sharpen attention. Detail in a secondary area can reward longer looking. Detail everywhere can make the piece harder to read. A cue can be accurate on its own and still throw the rest of the piece off. A shadow that's too sharp for the lighting can make the figure look pasted onto the ground. An overbuilt texture may change the perceived scale. A historically accurate color may read as plastic under the lighting of the piece. That is the difficult part. The maker remembers the work. The viewer only has what the piece gives them. At the bench, controlled illusion comes down to evidence. What does the viewer have enough reason to believe? What is being asked of them without enough support? What cue is helping the world hold together, and what cue is quietly pulling it apart? That is the work behind the small object, not just making the parts, but deciding what evidence the viewer has to build a believable place. I think this is why miniature work can stay with us in a way that's hard to explain. Smallness lets us see how carefully the scene has been arranged. When the illusion works, the viewer doesn't have to struggle to accept the scene. The piece gives them enough structure to enter, but leaves enough unresolved that the eye keeps testing what's there. Too little control and the scene falls apart. Too much explanation and the viewer has nothing left to do. But somewhere between those two extremes, the miniature starts behaving less like an object and more like a place. The piece doesn't have to explain everything. It should agree well enough that the viewer accepts the world it implies. A few inches of material can suggest a world larger than the space that has been physically built. And when it holds, even briefly, the piece stops being only a model of reality. It becomes a place the viewer can almost enter while still knowing perfectly well that it only exists within a few carefully controlled inches of space. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist, subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here, and I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their continuing commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, not obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.